The people who propose a basic income, while we're completely on the same page with them with goals, by and large, we can't find people who've done the same exercise that we did, which was really go through all the programs and really ask about how we would actually create it and actually integrate it and actually make it deliver money to the people who need the money. And once you do those things, it's not simple, it's complex.
The Rational View is a weekly series hosted by me, Dr. Alan Scott, providing a rational, evidence-based perspective on important societal issues.
Produced by Soapbox Media.
The world needs evidence-based public policy now more than ever. Making the right decisions should not be partisan politics. Please help spread The Rational View by going to patron.podbean.com/The Rational View. Together, we can make a better future.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Rational View. In this episode, I'm continuing my investigation into universal basic income as what could be the natural solution to the artificial intelligence and robotics revolution. One day, we should be able to work because we want to improve the world and our situations, and not do it because we are under risk of starvation or homelessness. The problem is that the intermediate period between having all our needs taken care of by our robotic assistants and having to compete with them for wages to put food on the table is not at all a clear path. My guest today chaired an expert committee that investigated universal basic income as an option for the British Columbia government. Their conclusion was that augmenting current social programs would be a better approach. It's time for a rational view. If you like what you're hearing, please press like on your podcast app. I'd love you to share it with your friends. I'd love to hear from you on my Facebook group, The Rational View. Dr. David Green is a professor in the Vancouver School of Economics at UBC. His areas of research interest include income inequality, immigration, the impact of technical change on the labor market, and labor market policies. He's a former editor of the Canadian Journal of Economics and an international research associate with the Institute for Fiscal Studies in London. He has served on the editorial boards for the American Economic Review and the Journal of Political Economy. His work has been published in leading journals, including Econometrica, the American Economic Review, and the Review of Economic Studies. He was also a member of the BC Expert Panel on Basic Income and has served as the president of the Canadian Economics Association. Dr. Green, welcome to The Rational View.
Thanks for having me.
So the reason I asked you to come on the show, you chaired an expert panel that delivered a report for the British Columbia government at the end of 2020, I believe, entitled Covering All the Basics, Reforms for a More Just Society. Now, this is a timely assessment considering the rapid advance of artificial intelligence expected to create, potential massive loss of jobs in the near term, along with a massive increase in productivity for the remaining workers. Now, your report advised the government that a universal basic income was not the most efficient means of providing support. Could you provide some context and maybe an overview of your findings on your expert report?
Sure. I think it's probably worth pointing out that what we were given to do this was a pretty good budget, access to very good administrative data and other data, and we used both to go out and attract a whole set of researchers. So there's actually over 40 research papers behind the final report, and people can find all of those. Part of our goal was to try to deliver an answer to the government, but part of it was to try to put evidence out there for other people to make up their own mind. Mm-hmm. And all of those reports are available on a website called bcbasicincomepanel.ca. Just like that, all one word, bcbasicincomepanel.ca. And you'll find the report, but also you'll find, like I said, over 40 research reports on various elements.
Okay.
And part of what we were trying to do was understand basic income in different ways. One was to try to understand it as an overall policy. Is this the best route forward? Mm-hmm. And I should say, and we'll probably get back to that in the discussion, we define the goal as trying to make, in that British Columbia, or more broadly Canada, a more just society, and we can talk about what that means. We're thinking about that as a general basic income as a general approach, as a key policy plank. One of the claims for a basic income is that its simplicity, that you can deliver everybody an income through the tax system, make sure that nobody falls below the poverty line, do it without intrusive investigations into the household. Nothing could be simpler. Our investigation, essentially, we came to the conclusion that the simplicity is not really true, that if you bring a basic income into the existing system, and again, we can get into this, there's not really a very strong case to be made that it would replace much of the existing system. You end up with something that's equally complex to what we have now. So then the question becomes, is this complex system with a basic income better at achieving a more just society than some other complex system, than, say, reforming the existing complex system? Because the existing system would need to be reformed for sure. And at that point, we got into the rest of the report, which is really sort of taking all the claims for a basic income one by one and saying, okay, is this true? Is the basic income the best tool for going after that? And in virtually all the regime realms, most of the realms, the answer was a basic income is a way you could go to address these, but it's not the best way. And so our conclusion in the end was you would go for a basic income only if you were sort of, a gun was put to your head and you were told you were only allowed one policy to hit all targets. But if you want to hit all these targets as effectively as possible, it's not that cash transfers wouldn't be part of the solution. They would be part of the solution. It's just that you need to think hard about how they would be integrated, and you need to use other tools as well. And a basic income as a policy proposal, as it's usually put forward, tends not to do that.
Okay. So maybe we could go through some of these points sequentially and dig into them a little bit. So you said we should talk about what a more just society meant. So how did you define a more just society in your study?
So one of the things we were trying to do, because of course people, you get a room full of people, you pretty much have as many notions of what a just society is as there are people in the room. So we first set out to try to find some commonality amongst those. And we spent a little part of the report arguing that commonality is that most notions of a just society include providing, as a central plank, providing everyone with the bases of social and self-respect. That equality of social and self-respect is sort of key to a just society. You find that referenced in a whole list of liberal theories of justice. You also find it's a central plank in sort of feminist notions of justice. It's there in indigenous notions of justice, sort of a central idea. So then what we tried to do was take that and say, okay, so how do you embody that? What is it you would be looking for if that were your goal? And part of our argument is that this sort of standard economic analysis of where we want to go with policy is too limited. I mean, it probably won't surprise anybody other than economists. And by the way, pretty much all economists know this as well. So I'm not here to slag that. That's not true. Economics, particularly in recent decades, has become much broader in this sense. But the policy making has sort of not gone along with where economics has gone. It's sort of stayed in the realm of efficiency as the target. And what we argue for is that you need to bring in issues or key elements, including community, which is usually not building community, which is usually not emphasized, and process, that it's key that people, in order to feel respected, are really part of the process, not just of designing the policy, but really in an ongoing way in the way it's implemented. Okay. And those tend to be sort of take you sideways from the general policy analysis. And they're both things on which we would argue that a basic income is not a great help.
Okay. So your recommendation, your preferred way forward to incorporate more people into the process, how did your study's preferred method incorporate more feedback from people or make them feel part of the process?
Yeah, a good example, I think, although there's debate, is the national housing strategy at the federal level. And what that has done, among other things, is it created an ombudsperson. It also has an advisory committee. That committee issues reports that go to the relevant minister and have to be read out in Parliament. So it sort of makes a direct place for people to have an input.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the case that you go to the committee and say, I was evicted from my rental unit and you guys need to do something about it. It's about policy direction. One of the groups that is really at the heart of all of this, that are, amongst sort of the most disadvantaged from this perspective of having the basis of social and self-respect, are people living with disability. And they talk constantly about not being part of the process. So part of what we tried to do was design a policy element that involved the people living with disability community, that meant that they would have sort of constant feedback into the policy as it was developed. It makes things messy. It makes policy harder to do, but it's part of saying, no, part of the way policy is done is a key element in thinking about a just society, not just the outcomes.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, you touched on the issue of complexity, and I think you basically suggested that UBI itself is complex. But I think one of the selling features of a single UBI is that it cuts across a lot of different targeting criteria, and it tries to eliminate gaps, I guess. And whereas if you slapping a whole bunch of different policies together to try and fill the scenario with all of, you basically end up with gaps in targeting.
Mm-hmm.
How did you address that, the issue of targeting and gaps?
No, it's an important point, and it's partially important as well because, of course, targeting comes with potentially intrusive investigations. It's part of the problem with the existing system is that many of the people interacting with it feel that it is disrespectful and overly intrusive.
Mm-hmm.
And I completely agree. One of the main arguments made for a basic income is that it sort of cuts through that. So our sort of conclusion in that area came from two things. One was part of the report, and you can see this again on the website, was an exercise in which we set out every policy, every sort of redistributive policy that affected people in BC. And it turns out there's 193 of them at all levels of government. And then we did an exercise. This was mostly done by Lindsay Tedds at University of Calgary.
Mm-hmm.
I should mention this. I was one of the members, as you said in the introduction. Lindsay Tedds at Calgary. The other is Reese Kesselman, who sadly passed away just a couple of months ago. What Lindsay did was go through, and then sort of interacting with all the rest of us, go through every policy and say, could I replace this with a basic income? Would that work? And in almost every one of them, the answer is no.
Okay, that's very interesting.
The main ones you could replace are essentially income assistance. So the actual ones that are actually cash transfers right now. But if you think about supportive housing policies, for example, those aren't easily replaced with a cash equivalent. If you give people a cash equivalent and say, please go and find, now go and find supportive housing, it doesn't work. And so if you're doing that, so now you're in a situation where you actually haven't eliminated much of what already exists, but you're going to bring in another program. That program has to integrate with all of those programs. So an interesting example of that is the CERB during COVID, which some people call a basic income. I don't actually think it was a basic income, but nonetheless, it was a major cash payment. There was a problem with integrating it with income assistance, and it varied by province, whether they counted that as income or didn't against people's income assistance. And if you look in all of these programs, for example, in British Columbia, they actually, most of them use a different definition of income. It's really, that's part of the complexity and the problem with the current system. You would think everything would just be, well, it's line whatever on your tax form, and we all use that. But in fact, the disability system uses a different income concept from the workers' comp system, for example. It sort of, does it account for lottery? How does it count your car? How does it count your house? All of those things differ across all of these things. And so bringing another program into that is complex, to say the least. The other thing to notice is if you bring it in and you sort of centered everything on it, we immediately face two problems. One problem is we have to find the people. Okay, so about 8% of Canadians do not file taxes in any given year. So that means we have to find those people in order to get the basic income to them. So the notion of we'll just pay it out through the tax system is not easy, especially since there's reason to believe, and one of the exercises we did, and again, one of the papers in the report, is we got to link tax data with census and other data, and then death records. So it's sort of like the one place that everybody ends up is in the death records.
Okay.
But we could see from that who were being missed in the other data.
Mm.
And one of the things we found out was about 4% of people who have social insurance numbers and are otherwise known to the government don't file taxes in a given year. But there's another 4% who are simply not in the government records at all. But we see them when they die. And those people are disproportionately, you can see cause of death, they're disproportionately dying from, overdoses, liver problems, other things that are, there's a US economist named Angus Deaton who labeled those deaths of despair.
Mm.
And so there's reason to think that the tax system misses the very people that we are most concerned with getting. So it would have to be adjusted somehow to deal with that. The other major problem with the tax system is that we only, you file your taxes once a year. So if you were to lose your job right now, you wouldn't be able to tell the government about that in the tax system until next April. So there would have to be a whole other system created to catch the people who are missing, who face sort of big negative shocks or problems during the year. All of those things, by the way, both of those things are what the income assistance system is set up for. It basically goes out there and tries to find people, and it is a month-by-month attempt to get money to people. So it's sort of like, our position was, we have a system that does this. Yes, it's flawed. We spent a bunch of time talking about how flawed it is. Let's get to work on fixing that rather than replacing it with another system that I can tell you before we even start has major problems and major complexities that we have to overcome. And that's the sense in which, our feeling in the end was the people who propose a basic income, well, we're completely on the same page with them with goals. By and large, we can't find people who've done the same exercise that we did, which was really go through all the programs and really ask about how we would actually create it and actually integrate it and actually make it deliver money to the people who need the money. And once you do those things, it's not simple, it's complex.
So as research to inform your study, you've obviously looked at various UBI pilot programs. What did you learn from reviewing the literature on these pilot programs, and how did that influence the work?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the main big pilots were done in the 1970s. In Canada's case, it was the Manitoba Income Experiment, done in Manitoba from about 1973 through 78, so roughly. There's a few things that we learned from those. One was basic income proponents often say, and we think it's correct, it's not going to have a big income, it's not going to have an impact. Most of the proposed versions are not going to have a big impact on labor supply. That is, would it cause a lot of people to withdraw from paid work? And the answer seems to be no. And that's one of the conclusions that come out of that. Now, it's sort of interesting when you get into it why that's a no, because it's actually because there's sort of offsetting effects. So in the Manitoba Income Experiment case, one of the papers in the project was by Craig Riddell, who's here at UBC, and his son Chris Riddell, who's at Waterloo. And they went back and reanalyzed the Manitoba Income Experiment data. And what you find is that, in fact, that zero came from offsetting effects. So single mothers, because it mostly was women who were sort of taking advantage of who were getting to use the system. Single mothers tend to move into work. It was better than the existing welfare system in terms of its disincentives to work. It was better for working.
Okay.
So they tended to move into work. Married mothers with children tended to move out of work, and they tended to move out of work when they had young children. So that, is probably a good outcome. It was meant that they were able to afford to stay home with the kids. So interestingly, the two forces sort of balanced each other, and you get an overall zero, but it's a sort of a redistribution. But the other thing I think is, one of the things to keep in mind about a basic income is that it's a big cash transfer. And we have lots of cash transfers, right, of various kinds. Some that are pretty unconditional, like the Canada Child Benefit and the GIS and OAS for people over 60.
Okay.
Some of them conditional, like the Canada Worker Benefit, which is a wage subsidy. So we have various systems that deliver benefits to people. And our argument is partially actually, we can learn a lot about how a basic income would work from looking at analyses of those programs. That's part of what happened in these various papers. So then the question is, so what is a pilot going to tell you over and above that? What could we learn from a pilot?
Mm-hmm.
And there, I think the answer is, part of the claim for a basic income is that it would be transformational, that it would allow people to really make huge changes in their life because they now have this backdrop.
The security, right?
Mm-hmm, exactly. The problem with the pilots is that none of them lasted long enough or were consistent enough for people to make any of those choices. Every one of them, that may be an overstatement, almost every one of them involved some political interference before they were done, right? So the Ontario one is a famous one. It didn't actually complete. There was actually interference in that project before it completed. The politicians were actually reaching their hands in and rearranging how the payments were going. And then MinCom completed, but there was a whole budget that was meant to be for analysis in some other parts. Those stopped because the budget was cut off, again, for political reasons before it was done. So you're in a situation where people are told this will last, say, 3 to 5 years, which is probably already not enough to allow them to do transformational changes. But in any case, it never makes it that far anyway. So you end up saying,
Right.
Look, the one thing we don't know anything about is, could a basic income be really transformational? And pilots, even though you sort of hope that they'll give you that, the way they've been run, and the way it probably will always be run, they don't give you that information, unfortunately.
So how did your study estimate the downstream cost benefit analysis in UBI? Like from a provincial point of view, when you're paying for healthcare, the decrease in chronic insecurity, the stress on healthcare, for example, on lifestyle, costs of incarceration, costs of all of these other programs that UBI proponents say would throw money back in and pay for it in a holistic form of thing. How did you account for that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think at this point it's sort of helpful to talk about its specifics again. Part of our concern is that a lot of this gets into generalities, and in fact, the devil's in the details. And if you stay at the level of generalities, you may, people. It's easy to say, yeah, okay, we'll agree, a basic income is a good thing, but it's the details that matter. So let me talk about a specific area. The group that is probably the most vulnerable in our society, most lacking in the basis of social and self-respect, are youth aging out of foster care, right? People who've been taken from the homes for various reasons, and then were in the foster care system, and then basically in most provinces at age 19, they age out of the system, all right? Now, one possible solution at that point is to say, they don't have enough money, a basic income will help them to deal with what comes next. And we agree on the income side. Okay, so one of our proposals was that there be something that looks sort of like a targeted basic income for that group that phases out over time. The phase out would stall if they go to get more education, because one of the problems in that group is a real lack of education. But if you think about this group and you think, suppose I gave these young people who have no supports by and large, $20,000 a year and said, good luck. It seems clear to us, and in fact, if part of what we did was go through, talk to people in these communities ourselves, but also go through exercises, go through the documents from exercises that do this kind of work, talk to people, young people, and the people who work with them. Even in that community, you'll find plenty of people saying this is not the right approach. This is going to end in problems, at least some of the time. So what we proposed was that, combined with essentially an attempt to build community around these people, essentially an attempt to make sure that they had the supports. In BC's case, it turns out that about 2/3 of the youth aging out of care are Indigenous. So the goal would be to reinforce and put serious money into the organizations that are Indigenous that work with people, for example, on the downtown east side. the young people would get their money, but they would get it by first signing up with one of these organizations. And then the goal would be to make the organizations actually have input from the young people in the way they run and in their governance. And so part of, as you came back to your question about sort of the accounting side of things, one of the exercises we did do was tally up the use of the healthcare system, the criminal justice system, and various other, essentially social spending that was related to these young people. And the number that we came up with was a present value of about $170,000. That is, if you took $170,000 the day one of these young people turns 19, put it in a bank account with a regular interest rate, and then over the next, say, 30 years, you draw it down and draw down the interest rate, that stream would basically pay for all of the services, all the extra services that group uses. And so in some sense, you can see yourself, which I think is what you're saying, you can sort of see yourself as saying, okay, what if we spend $160,000 on these? What if we put that aside? And there's about 1,000 of them a year in BC. So part of our argument to the BC government was like, that's not nothing, but it's not a big number relative to your budget. You do that and put it into exactly these kinds of things. Build supports, build community, build the kind of things that young people growing up in well-functioning families get. Right? You don't send them out the door with money and wish them well. It's not what we do. I mean, whether you have children, my children. Oh, right. Yeah. So you would not take that money and say, okay, we're going to give that to those young people, a lump sum of $170,000 and hope that would solve those problems. And it's not the case that the basic income people are saying that. These people aren't dumb. But what they are saying is, let's focus on getting them enough money to the poverty line and we'll worry about the other things later. That's not part of their solution. And part of our argument is, no, all of these things are complex and they're interrelated. If you want to create actual solutions, you have to think about the combination of the cash benefit with the other supports that make it actually effective. To worry about housing, to worry about, often these are people who have complex combinations of needs, right? Mental health problems, substance abuse problems, low education, no housing, bad employment records. And money is not going to be a magic wand that's going to cut through that. It's going to be part of the solution. They need support. We're completely in agreement that the levels of support are not high enough. We're also in agreement that we need to spend money, that our report was not critical of a basic income on the notion that this is just too expensive. If we want to make a more just society, we have to spend money. It's just, we think it is a complex problem that needs integrated solutions.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so my first feeling about all of these complex solutions to complex problems, which probably is realistic, is that we're going to spend more money on the bureaucratic infrastructure to govern all of these things and check them and implement them than we're going to get savings. So it's a bit of a catch-22, I think. So in my mind, it's the simplicity versus the complexity, but you're saying that the simplicity just isn't there, that you're still going to be implementing a complex program either way. But maybe,
right, and I should say that I think, in fact, to us, part of the answer to that, so again, looking for savings, it's sort of like you're saying you're not going to find it. So it's less about the savings side, it's less about the money side than it is the other part, the bureaucratic side. And the bureaucracy, we had this interesting discussion at one point with a group of people from the community of people living with disabilities. And in the discussion with them, they said, look, what we really hate about the system is it's very disrespectful to us, and we want to work. We feel like we have things to contribute, but if we work, and they claimed even if they volunteered, they would lose their benefits. So they all said, all we can do is sit at home, because if we do anything that looks like work, they're going to disentitle us. So we went back and talked to the government people, and we were like, this is nuts. Like, why are you doing this? And their answer was, we don't do that. We haven't done that in 20 years. We used to do that. We stopped that. We have a policy against that. And we tell them we don't do it. But that's not the feeling on the other side, right? So you end up with this situation where even bureaucracies that are trying to do the right thing are having troubles doing them. That's part of our argument, that what you need to do is figure out a way to build policies that are community, that are about building community. So in the youth aging out of care, it's about building these kind of support places where you give real resources for them to happen and that they're part of the process. And that's going to be honestly probably more expensive and messier than a standard government bureaucracy. But it'll mean, even if you don't get the cost savings, you get something that doesn't feel like intervention and intrusiveness from, essentially a faceless bureaucrat, which is what a lot of people feel like when they're facing these systems.
One of the reasons that universal basic income is a popular concept, I think, is similar to Medicare in that it applies to everyone. There's this reciprocity here in UBI that makes everyone feel included versus, targeted programs to the poor that you always get opposition by the people that don't want to share their hard-earned money with people that aren't working to help them not work, and with everyone feeling the pinch of higher prices, I think we're going to get politically a lot of pushback on the idea of spending money just on the poor. Was there any political assessments of palatable programs that would have general support? And was that even taken into consideration in the study?
Yeah. So one of the papers on the website, we got some of the top political scientists in Canada who are here at UBC. They designed a survey. We went out with this survey, and it was kind of a cool survey. So what happened was they asked people questions about support for various kinds of basic income policies. And I want to get back to in just 1 second, I want to get back to that question about the sort of universality, because that's important. They sort of gave them different scenarios, and by and large, there was positive support for basic income. Okay, so more than 50%, so roughly 60% were in favor. It varied with the nature of the basic income that was being proposed. The one where everyone gets a check was actually about the least popular. But what happened next was we also asked them, or they asked them, for their income in broad categories. So can you tell us, is your income, 50 to 60,000, 60, 70,000, whatever. And then in sort of real time, we created a calculator that they could use. So for every scenario, they could say, okay, if this is your tax range, if this is your income range, here's what would happen with this basic income implemented. So if your income is low enough, you would get the benefit, but you wouldn't pay much extra in taxes. So it would be a net benefit to you. At a certain point, you reach this sort of break-even point for any system. And above that, the taxes that you would pay to make the system work are greater than the benefit that you would get, right?
Sure.
And we were able to tell people this is what would happen to your taxes or your transfers if a basic income was brought in of this kind. And once we did that, then the support went to sort of just south of neutral. So instead of being like 60%, it goes to under 50%. Not way under. There's still actually a fair number of people who seemingly were willing to say, yeah, I'd be in support of this. Some portion of them were people who would benefit, so that was a little more direct. But plenty of people whose incomes were higher and who would bear a net cost, who were saying that they were in support. So that was our attempt to try to get at the political side, because one of the claims for a basic income is, even if it's not the best policy, it's something that is an easy political rallying point. It will get people to concentrate on it. And one of the other claims that is sometimes made is we need to deliver it as what's called a UBI, universal basic income, where literally everybody gets the same check in the mail.
Right.
And the idea is that makes everyone feel kind of like you're saying with Medicare, we're all in this together because we're all getting this, right?
Yes.
The issue is that to pay for that, you need to raise taxes somewhere. In a general progressive tax system, you will raise it towards the top. And so those people will on net actually have their income go down.
Right.
The other is just the pure cost of that. So in the BC case, a universal basic income at $20,000 costs essentially the same amount of money as the total budget of British Columbia. Okay, so in other words, we would literally have to double the average, not the marginal, the average tax rate of everybody in British Columbia to pay for that policy.
Now, is that including the clawbacks from taxes?
Well, that would be the clawback from taxes. So essentially, it would bring it from there. And because of that, there is almost no, I think there may be one, but if you look at all of the basic income proposals in Canada, they are all income contingent. Okay, they all have the form, if you have zero income, you get, say, $20,000. And then every dollar of income that you earn or you get from some other source reduces your basic income benefit by 50 cents. So once you hit $40,000, you'll be at zero. And then everybody above 40,000 doesn't get anything in the way of a check. They still have to pay taxes to cover the money that's going to the people below 40,000, but they won't get a check. That's the form of almost every basic income proposal in Canada.
And that's kind
so
of like
that means
a means-based testing approach. So
it is.
The more you work, the less you get. It's kind of a dissuasionary factor for working. Is that? I think
correct.
That's one of the drawbacks to that sort of thing, is that, why would I work harder when I get less benefits?
That's completely right. But part of the point here is, even if you did the UBI version where you send everyone a check, as I said a moment ago, somebody has to pay the taxes to cover those checks, which means, in fact, those two systems aren't actually very different. If your income is high enough, even under a UBI, yes, you're getting the $20,000 check in the mail, but your taxes that you're paying at the end of the year are more than $20,000 in order to cover the system. So even in that system, you actually face the problem that you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
One way to put that is, it's a cash transfer. We know that cash transfers have these disincentive effects. You always have to phase them out somehow. And so a basic income doesn't escape that. Even though proponents will sometimes say, oh, it's great because we don't have the welfare wall. One of the things that we did in another one of the papers was to take data from British Columbia and put it through simulations of about 1,600, I think, different variants on basic income. So where we varied how much is the transfer, what's the tax back rate.
Mm-hmm.
And we did it first just to see how much each one of those would cost. And then we did it also to try to say, okay, suppose your target was to reduce poverty, the number of people with income below the poverty line, as much as possible.
Sure.
How would you design those parameters? And the answer is, you give as much money as you can to the people at the bottom, and then you tax back, because the money that is above the poverty line that's still going to people is not useful for that target. So in other words, you end up back with one of these systems again.
Sure. I mean,
so you end up with something that looks a lot like the income assistance or the social assistance system.
Yeah. If your goal is to just get people to the poverty line the most efficient way, then you give the poorest people the money and cut it off when it gets to the poverty line. That's definitely the most efficient way to solve that problem. But QED, is that the problem we're trying to solve?
No, completely. That's completely right. I completely agree. But then if the next argument is, oh, but we can do this by just giving everybody a check, and then we don't face the problem of the tail off, of people facing, as I earn more money, my taxes go up, and therefore it's not worth it to me to earn more money. As I said, if you're going to pay for a universal basic income, you're still going to have that. You're still going to have that issue. Somebody with more money has to pay more than they take in, or else there's no system. Nobody's parachuting money down to us. So,
did you attempt to quantify some of these downstream benefits? I know you said that the studies just didn't have enough data. So, did you just say, okay, well, throw our hands up and not assume any savings on healthcare, not assume any savings on incarceration, and just assume everything is equal in that level, or did you attempt to put some numbers on these things?
We did. So, and there again, like I said, what we did was sort of take each one at a time and try to see what we could figure out. So one of the big ones, as you're saying, is healthcare. There's a sort of a notion that it reduces stress. That leads to, among other things, better decisions, better health outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
There's sort of two pieces of evidence out there. So because we couldn't implement a basic income, we have to go look for what we could get. One is, there's various ones, but one is actually from the Manitoba income experiment. So one of the key pieces of evidence that proponents put on the table is a study by Evelyn Forget in Manitoba, who's an economics professor there. And what Professor Forget did was go and analyze the Manitoba income, sort of reanalyze the Manitoba income experiment, and in particular look at the outcomes for the people in Dauphin, Manitoba, where it was what was called a saturation site. Everybody in town was given access to the basic income, and then essentially what happened was it was designed so that you could compare what happened to the residents of Dauphin relative to the residents of other places. And Professor Forget claims in a study that that led to a reduction in healthcare by spending by about 8%. But one of the things we did was take that data and reanalyze it. And when you went back in, you found that, in fact, Dauphin was already on a downward slope relative to the other communities. And so what happened during the MINCOME years was actually not different from what was already an ongoing trend. And it continued after the MINCOME years. So by the time you look at this, the numbers that we could get out of that data come much closer to zero. In fact, some of them seem like there were actually some increases, which probably is a good thing, right? So if one of the things you're hoping is that it allows people to be less scared about their job, that may mean that they can actually go to the doctor when they need to go to the doctor. So that's one. Another is an experiment that was done on the downtown east side just in the last few years, where they gave money to a set of people and followed them and surveyed them. It's quite a good study. The people who implemented that study sometimes argue that this shows evidence in favor of a basic income, but if you look at the actual estimates, essentially none of them are statistically significant on the health outcome side. And so that tends to be the outcome. The other one we did was we went back to old changes to the income assistance system in BC and said, okay, when they took money away from people in various ways, what happened to health? So one of the interesting ones was they changed the age. So in any income assistance system, at least the Canadian ones, if your youngest child is below some age, then you just get the money. You don't have to look for work or do anything else. And it used to be in BC that age was 7, and they lowered it to 3. So we tried to find out what was going on with the families that were affected by that essentially reduction in access to income assistance. And what turned out to be the case was there were essentially no changes in the health outcomes for the children. There was a reduction in preventative care visits for the mothers. So they were less likely to go for a pap smear. They were less likely to go for a GP visit. So some of those things are there. But the total spending on healthcare actually didn't change very much. So our conclusion from all these things was there's not much to be had in savings in those regards. The part that has to do with the criminal justice system, there is something there when people come out of the criminal justice system. So there's sort of two ways to look at it. One is, can we do something that helps prevent those movements into the criminal justice system? I don't know of a study that shows that reduces criminality dramatically. Coming out of the criminal justice system, you find that people are disproportionately likely to end up homeless at that point. And so there, it could be that a basic income could help, or alternatively, again, supportive housing. So in some sense, again, our notion is, yes, this is a policy that could be effective, but there's a suite of policies that is probably more effective.
I mean, there's certainly a risk with recidivism, coming out of the justice system where, you're unemployable, you don't have an address, you can't get a job, you don't have any money. What do? You go back to crime. That's definitely something that should be looked at.
In some sense, our answer to, some of that is about falling back into the community that you were with before. You know what I mean? And our answer to that, again, is, well, let's think about how we deal with that. And that would be supports for employability. It would be housing, because those people have trouble finding housing. People don't want to house them or don't want to rent to them. Part of it would be income, for sure. There would be an income support element. It's just that there would be all the other elements too. And our worry is the basic income approach to policymaking as part of the debate sort of simplifies things too much and takes us away from where the sort of the suite of solutions that we need.
Have you been following UBI studies since your report came out? Has there been any new information that might alter your conclusions or change what you've thought about it? Or, have you been following at all, and what things might be interesting to you?
We've been following, yes, to some degree. I haven't seen yet a study that was really effective, that was well enough designed to give more information. So a lot of things that are called basic incomes are not really basic incomes. So, for example, the CERB is not really a basic income because it was conditional. It was also funded on the fly, where there's this sort of notion of like, it doesn't matter how big the deficit is going to be, we're going to pay for this and worry about it later. But as we were talking about earlier, how you pay for it matters. You change the tax rates, you change how it's taxed back, you change everything about how other people, including the people who are getting the basic income, interact with the other systems. And so it's not a piece of evidence that's actually particularly helpful for this. So I think the other one, there is one that's on the table right now, which is sort of interesting, which is that PEI has proposed a basic income, and there's a sort of a team of people who've helped them work out the details for it, with the argument being implemented here on a long-term basis. The federal government should pay for it. That will essentially act like a big saturation site. It's like we'll see the long-term effects of basic income because we will sort of replace the income assistance system in PEI with that. Mm-hmm. That one's interesting. There's serious people involved in that. But again, to my mind, well, it hasn't happened yet. But again, to my mind, there's problems in the details. So in that project, they're proposing that the federal government would pay for 65% of the basic income, of the cost of the program, which essentially means like money is being parachuted into PEI. So that means that they don't have to raise taxes as much there or do all of those kinds of other things that we were talking about. So that's going to make it problematic to really figure out what the impacts of that are.
Sure.
And the other thing that they do in that project is, in order to try to get the cost down. So it turns out that when you try to cost out a basic income, a reasonably sizable portion of the money actually goes to young people living at home. Okay, so you're writing everybody a check. That's part of the idea of a basic income. Everybody gets a check, so that makes it possible, for example, for women living in abusive relationships to walk away because they have their own check. Mm-hmm. That's true. But that means that you're writing checks to a bunch of young people who are living at home. And by some estimates, it's almost 40% of the total cost of a basic income would go there. So what they proposed was they would switch, which is not the way our tax system is run now. They would switch to having the taxation and transfers done on what's called a census family basis, which means if somebody is in your house, if you have, your 20-year-old is living in your house, mm-hmm. they're counted as part of your house, and the calculation of the benefit would be based on the whole total household income. So, depending on your income, they wouldn't get a check anymore. But that means creating a whole intrusive part of system to figure out who's living where, and to decide whether, if your son is in your basement 2 nights a week, is that count or does it not count? So it's sort of a funny thing where they're claiming this is a basic income, but in fact, it's very conditional. So, it's a long-winded way of saying most of the attempts to try to figure out what a basic income would do have either a lot of conditionality or they're short-term. And so the short answer is no. I haven't seen much out there that would really seriously alter the landscape so far.
So your report made several suggestions or ideas for the BC government to implement. How do you feel the government has responded to your report, and how have they gone forward with this? Are you happy with how they've implemented your suggestions?
That's a good question. I mean, in some ways, yes. It's been sort of, we feel like things have come up and that they seem very strongly related to things that we suggested. I don't think, for the most part, the government would say that, right? Like, it's not like they want to give away credit. I do know from talking to some of the people that we talk to who are sort of mid to, sort of more in the civil service, that our report is known in the government. and has been discussed and is used to defend. But in all honesty, like my experience from sort of like years of doing policy work related to government is it's not that common to go to government and say, you should do X. And they say, okay, great. We never thought of X. Why don't we do X? It's more like you provide cover for the people who are trying to do smart things. Like that they sort of pick it up and say, see, I told you we should be doing that. And now there's this study. And so then you sort of help the people who are already working on ideas that, fit with what we see as the evidence. And in some ways, I think that's probably the right way to read the impact of our report. Less, okay, we said do these 5 things and they did those 5 things. More, here's evidence that's helpful in thinking about how you're making policy, and hopefully the people in there who want to think about evidence-based policy are using our report as a sort of a bludgeon to beat back the other people.
So, I mean, this study was as per a directive from the government. They basically said, I want you guys to go do this study. Were the guidelines restrictive in any way, or did you feel that there was political flavoring on what you should be doing, that was, they were influencing the direction they wanted this to go, or did you feel you had a free hand to do what you needed to do?
No, it's an interesting point. So we did feel we had a free hand. Part of that, funnily enough, came out of the way it arose. So the way it arose was it came after an election in which the NDP, could form a minority government, but only with the support of the Greens. And so then there was sort of a written agreement. The Greens didn't join the government, but they said, okay, it was like a confidence and supply agreement, I think it's called. Anyway, it's an agreement that says you do these things, we'll keep voting for you in the key votes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And let the government survive. And one of the things they actually said they wanted, because the Greens have a position in favor of a basic income, was a pilot. Shortly after the government was formed, they had a set of people, I wasn't at that particular meeting, some of my colleagues were, where they got people together and say, well, what would a pilot look like? And the outcome of that meeting was, actually, we've got to figure out what a basic income is and what it does and whether we want it before we go running off and spending a bunch of money on a pilot. And so then we were brought in to do that work. We immediately said, we want it to be broader than that. We don't want to just tell you a basic income thumbs up or thumbs down. We want to be able to analyze the whole system and talk about alternative policies. And they agreed to that. And so that immediately, sort of relaxed things. But then the other thing I always felt that, and this is just what I believe, I don't have any evidence in this.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't want us to come back with a quick answer. They were happy for us to go and study things, because the NDP didn't really like a basic income, and the Greens really did. So the moment we came in and said one answer or the other, now they were in conflict, and it made it harder for them to stay alive as a coalition. And so from their point of view, it was like, go away, study as much as you want, come back in a few years after, here's all the resources you need. Don't be so usually
after the next election, please.
Exactly. So usually when you're commissioned to do a study, they're like, oh, and we want it next week. And you're like, well, that's not possible. Mm-hmm. But this was like, they literally gave us 2 years. They gave us lots of resources. So no, we didn't feel restricted. And we had one of the things we insisted on, which, by the way, was the problem with the Ontario basic income experiment. One of the things we insisted on was that we held intellectual property rights. That's why everything is published on that website. We was like, we're not even starting if we don't own the rights to put everything out as much as we want. In the Ontario basic income study, the group that did it asked for that, but were not given it and decided to go ahead anyway. And that's the reason everything was stopped. When that program was stopped, when that project was stopped, it wasn't just that they stopped sending money out. They also took all of the records and everything they had learned so far and locked it away and told the researchers they were bound by their contract not to talk about it in public. So, yeah. So that was not our route at all. And no, we felt like we were given fairly unfettered access to funds and data.
What would you say is the most important recommendation that has not yet been implemented?
That's a good question. I would say that the government has made some moves on the youth aging out of care I would put a lot of emphasis on that. Part of it comes back to one of the things you said earlier, which is I think there's a possibility of real success in that area. It's a serious amount of money, but it's not a budget breaking amount of money. And I think it would build support. People would be able, taxpayers would be able to see that this was money well spent.
Mm-hmm.
Not hard to build sympathy for these young people. They deserve it. And I really honestly feel like an all-out policy expansion in that area would be really helpful as a step towards opening the door for other things. And that BC has done some things like that. They've moved to doing a better job of supporting those youth. It's just they haven't gone as far as I think they should go.
Okay. Very interesting. So thank you for spending your time and chatting with us today. I appreciate your insights. It's always nice to get to talk to the people that have put these works together and get their viewpoints. It's always also nice to have these elegant theories and then compare them to ugly facts and difficulties in implementing them. So I appreciate you coming and talking to us on this somewhat controversial topic. So for spending your time talking to us, I'd be happy to send you a Rational View t-shirt.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Thank you so much.
Can I also say, one of the reasons I said yes to this was because I looked up your website. Honestly, I'm sorry to say or your podcast. I didn't know about it before, but I actually really appreciate what you're doing, trying to make room for debate that is, just rational. And there could be different sides. Plenty of people who believe in basic income will be shouting at this and saying I'm wrong in various ways, but it's good to have an opportunity to have people have a discussion, and I really appreciate what you do.
Thank you. I can hear them psychically yelling at me right now. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, take care.
If you'd like to follow up with more in-depth discussions, please come find us on Facebook at The Rational View and join our discussion group. If you like what you're hearing, please consider visiting my Patreon page at patron.podbean.com/therationalview. Thanks for listening.